Hi, Michaela.
Hi, Steve.
Well, today we are going to deal with a question that came up in a recent workshop, and that subject is anger. Now, some people see anger as bad, it's toxic, it's something to be avoided or dealt with and banished maybe from one's repertoire of emotion. Other people think, no, anger actually is very, very good, and we should cultivate anger. It's very, very good. It's always a good thing. And then there's shades in between of that, and there are all kinds of different ideas and approaches to do with anger, especially working with anger in practice. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts about that subject?
Yes, anger. I think anger is one of these things that requires a lot of talking about and questioning because it's such a hot topic, right? And like you said, it goes everywhere from like super toxic to it's the most important emotion to work with. And of course, all of those aspects are true, but all of those aspects have to be seen within a very specific context. And we have to look at anger in the context of, let's say, the relational aspect and then the practice aspect. And they're not the same. And sometimes people conflate those two, and it can get quite sticky and quite toxic at times. So I would say having anger, feeling anger, expressing anger, or not expressing anger till somebody completely blows up is something that in private practice I've had to deal with since the inception of me being in private practice, because it is one of the emotions that in relationship is the hardest to deal with. And of course, there's a lot to be said about anger in relationship because anger in its very nature is very destructive and it is very toxic under circumstances, most circumstances. And so relationally speaking, and humans in the world interacting with each other, anger has to be seen in one specific way or can be seen in one specific way. And we can learn how to work with anger, express anger, metabolize and release anger, and be able to work with it. And that's definitely worth talking about. But then there's the practice realm, right? Meaning transforming one emotion into another or using a strong emotion to propel your practice or your inquiry or things like that. So there's a whole other realm that is more like a solo inquiry within a practice container where you're not actually bringing your anger to another person, but you're working with strong emotions within yourself. And I think that's a whole other area to work with. And so I want to start with the relational piece because that's where mostly things go wrong. So I think it's important to start by saying that human beings, for the entire inception of humankind till now, have survived with the use of anger or aggression, right? Anger/aggression, meaning when you're like traversing the savannah with your small band of no longer cave dwellers, and you get attacked by another band of, people or wild animals, you're going to have to activate your fight or flight. And in the fight, there's a certain upwelling that would be considered anger, right? Like aggression. And so aggression and anger is a survival response, first and foremost. And in the context of that, has to be seen as something that takes you over so you can live. And so a lot of times when people talk about, having completely almost blacked out in their anger and things like that, that is in fact what happens when you see anger not in a context of relationship, but when you see anger in the context of how the nervous system defends itself against a threat, a life-threatening situation. And the first and foremost thing that always happens in fight or flight is that essentially your executive thinking function is cut out. So your body just goes at it as hard as it can or runs as fast as it can so you may live. And so dissociation, so to speak, the kind of almost blacking out, not feeling anything, is a function of survival. And that is important to, I think, say when we talk about why people get so caught in anger and how anger is such a different emotion from, let's say, sadness. When you cry and there's loss and you wail and all of that, that's typically not an emotion that is in the survival circuits of your body, and hence it's also somewhat easier for other people to work with. But anger is one of those things that elicits both in the doer and in the receiver very strong survival circuitry, and that's why anger, I think, is kind of almost a freestanding thing to consider amongst processing emotions or being with emotions. So I think that's where I want to start, because that does separate anger in the way I work with it in private practice and how we work with it in workshops. And as a matter of fact, we will actually be working with it in a workshop next year specifically, because it is such a distinct circuitry that happens. And with all of that said, in relationship, when anger shows up, there's a few things that can happen. The first thing that can happen is that it is that kind of ballistic anger that comes from the survival. Somebody got either triggered from old stuff, or triggered in the moment, and then the whole thing explodes, and there's very, let's say, strong emotions being emitted. In the best scenario, in the worst case scenario, the strong emotion comes with an action, right? And that, of course, makes it very, very hard to deal with, because once we're now in physical expression of anger, we are far in a topic that's goes into survival, right? And that goes into fight or flight. So ideally, people don't get to that point, but very often when strong anger happens, things get thrown at walls, and, dishes are destroyed, or worse, right? Walls being punched. You hear that a lot, even from very level-headed people, that when anger takes over, it takes over with the full mobilization of what's there. So with that said, fresh anger or old anger still might have the same kind of also physiological effect of the rationale going out the window, that strong upwelling of energy going up the front of the body, which produces that red face and, all of those kind of things. And so I think it's very, very important to say, for what I say later about practice, that anger in that form, of course, is violent, right? It is always violent, because the receiver of that is going to have the exact reaction that they would have when they get attacked on the street or wild animal. Sometimes it's even worse, because it's somebody where you have your guard down. So that kind of expression of anger is a real problem in relationship, and it certainly needs to be handled. And now when we talk about the handling of anger, some people say, well, all emotions need to be let out. You shouldn't suppress anything. That's not entirely true when you're with another human. Right? There's a place and a time where you should learn how to suppress your emotions and your behavior so you don't hurt somebody, so that you don't scare your children or hurt them, or your spouse or somebody on the road. So being able to somewhat keep a grip on anger is an important learning, right? And you have to, if you tend towards explosive anger, you will have to do somatic steps and therapeutic steps to be able to hold the lid on your anger so it doesn't damage somebody, because anger is violence. Even if you don't hit somebody, it's very violent. So that, I want to say that while it's important to understand why you get angry, while it's important to understand and have places where your anger can be expressed, it is not with another person, unless they consent to that in some way, like a therapist, for instance. And even then, there's caveats. Having been on the receiving end of that, I can tell you there's caveats. So I think that's important to say, that anger, of all the emotions that people want to work with or express is one of them that you don't necessarily want to put on other people, because there will be collateral damage, and there will be, even if they're willing to hear you be angry, they'll still have that response in the body that they then need to process and that they need to deal with, and that gives them certain trauma responses and things of that nature. So ideally, we wouldn't get angry at our partners, but alas, that happens, right? But at least you want to know that when it happens, that how to work with it, calm yourself down, process it, apologize, all of those kind of things, because it is a violence, right? Now, not everybody sees it like that. Some people think it's passionate in a relationship to essentially scream at each other like mad and throw things at the wall and then have furious make-up sex. And that works for some people, but for the long term of the relationship, it's probably not optimal. And it's certainly not optimal if you have children in the house or neighbors. So I want to say that first.
That's very interesting indeed. And something that one often hears with people who advocate working with anger is that anger as an emotion can be a sort of Google Maps to a deeper issue. There's a sense in which the anger that one feels now in reaction to what may be happening might have a deeper vein, going back to a deeper anger, past anger, in fact. Something to be addressed on a more fundamental or systematic level. So what do you think about that? As anger as a kind of X marks the spot for psychological investigation or emotional investigation or whatever the case may be? And how to differentiate the anger that is in response to the moment and the anger that is a sign of something deeper?
Great question. So if we start talking about how do you work with your anger away from your partner or whomever, right? So meaning, how do you work with your anger within yourself? Then, like you said, you could say the X marks the spot of something that goes somewhere. It's a portal into something. So there's two differentiations that I want to make. One of which is old anger versus fresh anger, which also then later goes into practice. And the other one is primary emotion versus secondary emotion. And so let's talk about old anger versus fresh anger. So old anger, typically, that's the one that you're talking with, X marks the spot. Old anger is typically where a similar thing has happened before, or this always happens in the relationship or to that person, or this is something that they're familiar from a betrayal or an accusation or a withhold or something like that has happened before. Maybe with that partner, maybe, or in that work situation, maybe in childhood, maybe it's very traumatic. Maybe it's, it's just a recurring theme. So you can certainly go, well, every time X happens, I get extremely angry and I do X, right? And then work your way back into that. And what, of course, happens in that kind of anger is that everything that even looks remotely like the trigger for that original anger will trigger the same response, but maybe totally out of proportion. And people know that, of course, because it's like, you're fine. Somebody says a tiny little thing and you blow off the handle. And they go, I just asked you if you want butter on your bread, right? And they're very put out by the fact that the person, went, raving mad on that question. But the old anger that hasn't been processed or examined is, connected to something that is in the vein of the butter on the bread, but a long time ago, right? Where you were asked something that you had already said, or where you felt like somebody never listened to you and didn't know who you were. And suddenly you have this big outburst because your partner didn't remember if you wanted butter on the bread. But really what you're having an outburst about is that nobody ever sees you, or, nobody ever so far has ever given you the right kind of sandwich, or I'm being silly, but it's that kind of a thing. So yeah, you could go down and look at the anger that is accumulated on top of, underneath that last outburst. And that is typically what happens in relationship, right? Even within the relationship, that when the anger gets bad, it's the accumulation of the little things in the relationship that haven't been addressed, interpersonally as well as individually. And so that is the inquiry, and that's a therapeutic inquiry, of course, right? But then there's also fresh anger, and fresh anger is a bit different, because that would be something where something arises and passes. And so the difference there between your old stuff, your old unprocessed, somewhat toxic, like radioactive sludge of your psyche that suddenly erupts, that doesn't stop, right? Because it is radioactive sludge on the bottom of this thing. And once the cap comes off, more and more and more comes out, and the person actually doesn't calm down. There's actually, the ammunition is constantly fed to the surface from beneath, from that pent up stuff. That can be traumatic stuff, could also be somebody who never gets angry and has like 10 years of resentment stored down there, and suddenly the volcano blows and all this stuff comes out. Or it could not even be related to the partner. But so that kind of anger doesn't let up easily, and it can't be pacified very easily, because it's actually old stuff that needs to be cataloged, or insight created, or spoken about, or forgiven, or expressed, or moved out of the body, or all of the above, right? So that's one set of anger, old anger. And then fresh anger is something happened, you react to it, and the moment that's done, you are done. And meaning it's done its thing. It's not particularly abusive, because it might still be horrible, but it doesn't go on for hours of, and then you did, and no one ever understands me, and all of that. It's just like, no, don't do that. And then it's like done. And that kind of anger is more like the cleaner survival anger, let's say, where, for instance, you would do that if somebody's about to step on a snake or something, and you scream at them, or whatever. And it's not personal. It's just like you're giving this burst of very strong emotion that's needed to stop an action or something. And then it's like, right? People have to do this with their kids all the time, so that they don't get hurt. They're not really angry at them or trying to injure them. But nonetheless, when a kid gets screamed at because you scream at it before it puts the hand on the stove, it will still have the effect of being screamed at and potentially cry and be startled. And that, I think, is a good way to see how anger affects the nervous system. Even if it's meant out of love, it still produces that response. So that's old anger versus, let's say, freshly arising, somewhat content-free, or often content-free anger that then immediately moves. And then we have primary and secondary emotion. And of course, primary emotion is clearly just you're angry, right? And maybe it's even a fresh anger. And then secondary emotion, and that is often what happens in relationship, that the anger is the volcano top to sadness, and that there's a lot of hurt underneath there, and that the hurt eventually explodes into anger. But it's not really anger. And that's the other place when you say X marks the spot, right? Where somebody gets extremely angry, but then when they emote for a while, they start crying, and the sadness and the feeling abandoned and the feeling disrespected comes out. And there's an enormous wellspring of pain underneath, sadness, pain, underneath, grief that has been capped by this seething resentment. So those are all things to look at. And of course, many of these things need to be worked with therapeutically. Some of them can be worked with more, let's say, tantrically or yogically. and also somatically, where you allow the body to work with it, which often goes directly to the source. But very often when it's unexamined, it needs to be looked at and somewhat dissolved before you can move on. So with that said, I think there's a few things to consider when we talk about how do you actually work through anger and how do you better not work through anger. So best and worst practices. So there used to be a very big movement in the 70s, 60s and 70s around unlocking emotion, any kind of emotion, but unlocking repressed emotion. And that took the form of different movements, like, human potential movement, encounter groups, things of that nature. There was also the more somatic aspects that were certain methods were created where people were given a bat and a paper cube, or a Nerf bat and a pillow, or things of that nature, or they were invited to really let their anger out. And the idea was back then that if you would just let your anger out fully, then it would, cathartically cleanse your system, and then you would be fine, and you'd come to a sense of, homeostasis and equilibrium, and you would be a better person in the world. Well, it turns out that didn't quite turn out so well. And now looking back on it, a lot of that was done during those days, both, let's say, therapeutically as well as in these groups or in these movements, actually had a very adverse effect. But the funny thing about this is that of course, people forget that, and a lot of these things are coming back. I have recently seen on Instagram people beating pillows and having, screaming in the woods kind of situations going on, which is exactly what happened in the 60s and 70s, and now is kind of making a comeback. And I want to just say that one of the reasons why that's typically not a good idea, typically, I'll give a few caveats, but typically not a good idea, is that whatever you practice is what you get more of. And that means when you practice anger, which is what you're doing when you're beating pillows and beating things with bats, you're actually opening the pathways wider. And if you have trauma on those pathways, because you weren't able to express anger or rage, because now we're talking old rage that's being expressed. Fresh rage doesn't need a 15 or 20-minute session of beating a pillow. Fresh rage comes and goes. Old rage is connected to all these different people and circumstances and emotions. And when you practice rage to relieving rage sake, you're essentially preparing for peace with war, right? That old saying, because you're essentially reopening these patterns, and you're also giving the trauma a bigger pathway. And so very often it turned out people who engaged in very vigorous kind of like those cathartic processes had maybe, that moment of crying and feeling okay and spent, but it set the pathways up for another round, and then it had to go again and again and again. So I personally, in my 26 years of working with people, have not seen it work in that context, and particularly not if it's held by some facilitator, taking people into the woods to scream at the trees. Don't scream at trees, people, for the trees' sake as well. But it's it's not useful in the therapeutic sense. It might make a good workshop. It might make feel good for the moment, but it's definitely going to just create more of the pathway you don't want. So that's the first thing. Now I'm saying there's some caveats, meaning ever so often there's circumstances where going back through an entire process can be useful, but that can only be done with a super, super skilled trauma therapist who really, really sees the signs of the dissociation and stops it. Because very often when people start beating the bats and hitting the pillows and all of that, they just go up and out. They're not even there. And I've seen it, and it's quite, from a trauma therapeutic standpoint, it's very, very scary because people are gone. And that's not going to help address the issue. So I want to say that because people forget this has also all been done. The people have been damaged. The people have somewhat healed. Now it's being done again. So that's the thing. And there is things right now. People do sacred rage workshops, and stuff like that. Like I said, don't scream at trees or any other place in nature. But the real problem there is that it's a dramatization of something and a reenactment that's actually going to build a stronger pathway. And it teaches you to be disembodied in your rage, and it's old rage. So it's not really useful to let old rage out in that way. It's much better to let the body work with that while you sort it in a very specific way, which is a process. And it can be done it's very easy to do, actually. You just need to know how to do it, and it doesn't involve harming pillows or bats. So that's the first thing where it can go very, very wrong, right? The other way it can get very, very wrong in practice is people just denying their emotions, right? And they get super spiritual. They've seen the light, everything's perfect, every emotion, everything's perfect. And they just bypass right out of stuff. And they're like, oh, I never get angry. And underneath, there's just like this, really, really raging, serial killer living in the mother's basement kind of vibe, glossed over with some spiritual thing. Or some, yogi tantric thing. And so that's another way that it can go wrong in practice, where you just somehow go, oh, I've transformed all my rage and I'm now so spiritual. And that very often, of course, just leads back to the same thing, which is some explosive outburst that then hurts people, which you then have to feel bad. Then you have to apologize, which sets you up for the next thing. So, yeah, so classic spiritual bypass. And that, of course, is the other way that it can go in practice. But there is, of course, practice, both tantric practice, also, kind of other in various traditions practice, where you are taking these strong emotions and you're actually working through them, and you're actually using the emotion to cleanse your system, so to speak, and work with your system. And that's a worthwhile endeavor, in itself. And but that's for another day. So we'll I think end here. And maybe talk about, the more spiritual aspect and how to practice with it in the spiritual domain at another time. I also do want to say that we're going to do a workshop in Portugal next year called Thrive. And in Thrive, I'm going to actually lead that process with the distinctions around the angers for each person, and how to work with it, and what can be released and what needs to be addressed. Because picking apart and sorting through emotions is one of these things that frees a lot of energy. And particularly under anger, there's an enormous wellspring of life force. And that life force then can be used for the erotic, it can be used for the creative, it can be used for making money, right? So it's one of those areas where you really sort through your anger, it has a tremendous positive effect on the body. And that's one aspect of practice that's really worthwhile engaging in.
Yes, and that's going to be in Portugal. We're going to do that. The links to that will, of course, include in the show notes, and people can click through and find out more about it. Well, this has been very interesting indeed. Thank you very much, Michaela.
Thank you, Steve.